The IMF's decision to ease restriction on Rwanda's borrowing capacity has served the country well. Not only will it give the country access to foreign capital, but it will also allow the country to fund the much-needed infrastructure projects in order to compete with the rest of the world. Let's take a look.
Today, Rwanda is a very different picture when compared to that some 18 years ago. The city of Kigali is seeing a building boom, and this has been made possible by the influx of investors who are finding the business environment favorable. Rwanda has implemented 22 new regulatory reforms, one of which includes streamlining procedures for registering and starting a business. Whereas a few years ago, one would need to submit at least 10 different documents from different institutions. Now registration can be done online, which has increased the number of small and medium enterprises that are registering their businesses. Robert Fatta is a director at a project management company that implements large-scale infrastructure projects in emerging economies. He knows all too well some of the reasons that countries continue to lag behind.
Every dot I and T needs to be in place before we'll even move, whereas they will make things happen, which, you know, in Africa things need to happen quickly because we can't wait for 10 years.
For the private sector that is still emerging, strategic investments by government are necessary to facilitate private investment development.
I think the problem you have in many cases is maybe not so policy so much, but also government will. We have a good example of a large sugar company who's investing in West Africa. Part of the project was they were going to build the mill, and government needed to put in place the infrastructure and the commercial farmers. So now they've done all their bit, they've raised finance, they've designed the plant, but the governments now are doing the fast shuffle and saying, well, actually we don't have any money to do this now. If they'd said that on day one, the sugar company might have looked at this in a different way.
Taking the lead in large-scale infrastructure projects is the Isaka Railway project, with an estimated investment of $3.7 billion. This will aim to connect Rwanda with the neighboring country Burundi. And another project in the wings is the construction of the Bugesera International Airport. This is also aimed at attracting investors to partner with the government to finance an estimated $635 million venture.
Because governments haven't got very much money. No government's got enough money to do everything it wants to do. So governments need to leverage that private sector money and get it to do other things for it. Because, you know, governments want to build hospitals and schools and look after health and those sort of things, and that's a priority.
Rwanda's Vision 2020 paves the roadmap for the country's future. This policy will not only aim for greater integration between Rwanda and the rest of the world, but will spur the nation's well-being and fast-track the country's economy. Dumisha Mahanyele, Johannesburg.
Paul, just before the break, you spoke about the challenges with associated territories surrounding Rwanda.
On the eastern side, yes.
On the eastern side. In terms of the government now within Rwanda and the private sector, what kind of relationship are we seeing? We've obviously spoken about Kagame and his government doing all the right things, weeding out corruption. But are we seeing, in terms of closer advancement or closer working with private sector and government?
Yes, definitely. It's very much a partnership approach. And it's resulting in quite a few substantial investments. I mean, apart from the projects that were mentioned there's also a major pharmaceuticals plant that's going up. In other words, the amount of times, the number of times I can put industrial in the templates, the project templates, is quite gratifying, because that's the value add. That's what Africa really needs, and that's what Rwanda needs. So there's several, there's health laboratories, for example. There's a whole lot of manifestations of innovative projects that would only come about through a healthy relationship between government and the private sector.
Aly-Khan, do you think they'll manage to go beyond that 7 to 8% GDP growth if they continue with the current momentum we're seeing in the economy?
I think so, definitely. I think they're going to hit double digits in about 24 months. I think this is one of the most, well, if not the most well-organized country on the African continent. And, you know, just the organization is worth a number of percentage points. I also think, you know, although it's a very dangerous neighborhood, the Eastern Congo, it remains Rwanda's sphere of influence. And if you can get some kind of stability into that area, you should also get a further fillip to GDP. But I think they've got their own momentum, they've got enough of it, and I think they're well organized enough to take this to the next level. And I think that's their ambition.
Is Rwanda taken seriously by the East African community? In other words, do the other players in that territory see benefits of doing business with Rwanda?
I think so. I think just as Aly-Khan has pointed out, the East African community, the countries surrounding Rwanda, people coming into the East African community all recognize Rwanda as a very favorable and pleasing destination to conduct business in.
Aly-Khan, I'm going to throw it back to you in terms of the number one challenge you think that the Rwandans are faced with at this point.
I think the number one challenge, besides the logistical one, which we've already discussed, is really about human capital. I think, you know, they haven't got the deep pool of people that somewhere like Kenya has. But I think in terms of creating the DNA, they're creating the right DNA, the right conditions. You know, you can go and set up shop if you're an East African community citizen without any question in Kigali tomorrow. And I think that's going to be enough to square off what I would call is a near-term human capital deficit. But I'm pretty certain they're going to cover that base very soon.
Taking account what Aly-Khan is saying there, then there's great support for the entrepreneur and an entrepreneurial culture within Rwanda.
Yes, there is very much. But I want to just point out another challenge. Is everywhere in Africa, the major issue is power supply, electricity. We cannot talk about Rwanda without talking about the Lake Kivu methane project, which is starting to move now. I mean, there's talk of getting it up to 100 megawatts in the not too distant future. That methane gas has to be utilized. And that's very innovative. And I think that there's been some delays. I'm not saying all went smoothly there. If I speak to the people that went through that project, it was not always smooth sailing. But now there is action, and I think that's a key project. So power supply is a.
Will that solve the power supply issues down the line?
Not at 100 megawatts, no, but it certainly will alleviate. It's an inherent. There's also the Rusumo hydropower plant on the Tanzanian border, and that's
again, it's the East African community relationship that they're harnessing here.
Exactly, they cannot do that project without collaboration with Tanzania. So, and in Tanzania itself, I sense a lot of prioritization of Rwanda, to answer your earlier question.
I was just going to add that, you know, for all accounts, the Rwandan government plans to increase power capacity by 10 times by 2017. And with the will that they've already shown, it's likely that they may actually do that. And it's not a challenge that we in South Africa don't face, the issue of power supply.
Aly-Khan, now we've spoken about all the good things that Paul Kagame is doing and his government, obviously. What happens in the next election? Is there political risk here?
That's a very interesting question. And I think because he's such a totemic figure and he's so charismatic and so associated with his government, I think clearly it creates some kind of risk. And of course, if you know the history of Rwanda, the genocide, the whole situation behind it, I think one would have to be naive not to think there is a political risk in that handover when it does come. But I would like to think that they have done enough, that they continue to run ahead of the curve, and eventually that they will put themselves in a position to handle that properly and correctly. But, you know, you are quite right, Bronwyn. You know, there is a lot of political risk around in Africa, and that's exactly the rub of the political risk in Rwanda. But I'm convinced from meeting his people, meeting his government, and they're very accessible. If you're looking to invest in Kigali, they will reach out to you as well in a way you'll never find anywhere else. And when you look at the class of people in that group, you've got to be quite confident that they're going to manage this process.
Often associated with discussions around countries on the African continent, the beneficiation story comes up. How do we harness our raw goods and materials and translate them into products and benefit from the end price? Is Rwanda doing that?
Another sector we have omitted up to now is agriculture. And they are building, for example, they're establishing now a major wholesale food and flour market, which will have a regional connotation. It'll be of regional importance. So there's for example, cassava flour milling plant that's going up. There's plenty of evidence of this beneficiation of. Look, it has limited resources as a small country, But even
and they've still got the power issue to deal with.
And they've got the power issue to deal with, etc. But I mean, there are enough value-added projects to make it very interesting from that point of view, and it's attracting investors. I mean, the pharmaceutical plant it's Indian investors that are involved with that.
Are we going to see, earlier in the discussion, we said there weren't enough South African brands in Rwanda. Do you think now with the visibility that Rwanda is getting from the report in terms of ease of doing business in Africa, etc., we're going to see South African brands really making a charge for Rwanda?
I think so. In fact, I'm aware of some large South African infrastructure companies that are looking to Rwanda in relation to the infrastructure projects that are going up there. And they are keenly looking at those projects and considering tendering for those projects. So I think we're going to see some traction there.
Further to that question, Aly-Khan, do you think we're going to see FDI in general picking up into Rwanda?
Absolutely, and I think what is most attractive about it is eventually we're going to get a single community with single community rules in the East African, in the EAC. We're not there yet, we're a long way away from it. But I think that's going to happen pretty rapidly, particularly in places like the financial sector, where I think you'll see an equalization across the region. And then I think Rwanda's really going to come to the fore. It's going to prove a very attractive destination from which to play within the East African community. And I think that's what Kagame's end game is within the community. And I think some of the bigger brothers within the community are napping at the moment and not truly understanding the disjunctive risk that somewhere like Rwanda might present to vast swathes of their businesses, particularly the stockbrokers, for example, and others.
Paul, how are you going to help people in terms of doing business in Rwanda if we really go on the ground now?
Well, there you've just put your finger on it, on the ground. The only way that I can get and sensitize our companies to these benefits is to go there myself, come back and literally dangle the opportunities under their noses. There is still some reticence. And another thing that I find amazing, I'm generalizing, but the lack of knowledge, lack of basic knowledge of the region. That is a constant problem.
It's a black hole.
It's especially in South Africa. I think still our knowledge of African geography needs to be improved at that level, export manager level. And I constantly have, awkward questions, naive questions about it. And sensitization is what's going to be needed.
Well, let's hope that this goes to uncovering the Rwandan story, certainly deserving of more discussion later in this show.